Hi, this is Mike Bloom at the College of William and Mary. I recently had a chance to sit down and talk to Fred Corney, professor of history here at the college. Fred was the director of the Summer Study Abroad program in St. Petersburg in 2013, and I had the chance to talk to him and ask him about the student research projects and how things went this year.
We had 14 students this year in summer in Petersburg, and the program is an unusual program, I think, in the sense that it's got a significant research component. So we work with the students for a semester, trying to choose their particular research subjects. And some of these students chose some subjects which are relatively easy to research, such as buildings, sites, such as Peterhof Palace, for example. And others chose more conceptual terms, so some conceptual themes like souvenirs. One student chose souvenirs as a focus for her project, where she would be looking at how souvenirs are good reflections of Soviet culture or post-Soviet culture over time. So she would go all over the place in Petersburg and Moscow trying to find various souvenirs and what counted as a souvenir. There are obvious ones, the matryoshki, the znaczki, these little pins that you get, but also other kinds of souvenir remembrances, sometimes quite politically incorrect things as well. So this is all sort of reflective of broader Soviet or post-Soviet culture. That was one subject, and each student will do a one-credit course, choose their subject, and then while they're in Russia, they'll choose the site. You will usually have conversations about it in class, or we'll meet at the site as a group to discuss it. So one time we met at the Bronze Horseman statue, for example, and discussed that. Not this last program, but the program before. So the idea is that they write a piece which then goes onto our website at the end of the program, usually a month later, so they have time to write it. And that will then be on our website full time. So that's in consultation with me. They agree with me that it's good enough to be on the website. And there are about, I think we have about probably a couple of dozen from over the various past few years on the website. And they're all good pieces of work. They're all one piece in particular I remember was the Senner Ploshad, Haymarket Square, where a student 3 years ago went to that square a dozen times and wrote about it. He is now at Yale, actually, not because of that. But. So that's sort of the research component, and the other thing we do a lot of is traveling. We do a lot of visits, so we went to various palaces around Petersburg, various sites inside Petersburg. We also went to Moscow for a week this time, which was kind of an interesting extended trip. And in Petersburg I always try to do something that I haven't seen before as well, just to sort of keep it fresh for me. So this last time we did the Gatchina fortress, which is on the outskirts of Petersburg. It was actually destroyed by the Germans, but hasn't been rebuilt as much as the other palaces have as reconstructed. So you really get a sense of German destruction of palaces, actually, in that with the Gatchina. A couple of the projects were really interesting in the innovation. One was, generally students will often go to look at Orthodox churches, Orthodox cathedrals. They're studyable, you can actually get a real sort of hieratic sense from them when you're there. One student chose non-Orthodox places of worship along Nevsky Prospect, and then looked at various churches of various denominations to look at the kind of less obvious religious manifestations in Petersburg, and he was looking at the history of various of those churches. So that was one which has a lot of promise, I think, in when he gets the final paper. Another one which I think was a very good cultural artifact, which has been written about quite a bit in Russia, the Kommunalka, the communal apartment, which is, for those who don't know, the communal apartment is an apartment, a small apartment, where under the Soviets, because of lack of accommodation spaces, you could get 4 or 5 families living in a relatively small apartment, sharing the bathroom, sharing the kitchen, and then they'd have their own room. And often these rooms would be 20 feet by 20 feet, in which a whole family with maybe mother, father, 2 kids would live under the Soviets. In Moscow, I think so much has been renovated, those are disappearing. In Petersburg, you can still find traces of the Kommunalki. So one student decided to look at the Kommunalka, and she asked her homestay parents about it, asked any Russian she could find about the Kommunalka, what it was like to live in the Kommunalka, and what they liked. And so she saw sort of both negative for us in the West. It's a very kind of negative idea of living cheek by jowl with other families in one small apartment. But she also discovered quite nostalgic emotions in people about the Kommunalka, I think. And we even found in one of the museums we looked in Petersburg a kind of a mock-up of a Kommunalka, which will say something about its place.
Is that the Anna Akhmatova Museum?
No, it's the one on, it's the Museum of Political History near Petersburg Fortress. And so they have this little mock-up of the room, which is an interesting thing in itself about what they're saying about the Soviet past, right? So the Kommunalka was probably the best way, maybe along with the Souvenirs project, of getting at how the Soviet past is still existent in the post-Soviet culture, and in this unusual and sometimes quite tendentious relationship with the present, I think. And there is a lot of nostalgia about the Soviet past in Russia at the moment. So both these projects were looking at the way in which the Soviet past persists into the present in interesting ways.
So would you say that most of the projects had something to do with a grounding in places of memory?
Yeah. The theoretical inspiration for this was a series of readings that we do in the very beginning of the course, where we read about cultural memory and how memory is constructed for present needs, basically. And it's especially interesting in Russia because the Soviet period is essentially the end of a country, the end of a state. So you have this entire Soviet history with very problematic episodes in obvious ways. And any regime that follows that has to decide what to do with that 80 years of the Russian past, or 70 years of the Russian past. And it's a difficult process. So a sites of memory course like this, as I call it, is looking at moments or looking at sites of memory where you can examine the difficult relationship between the past and the present. Kommunalka is one of those. Non-orthodox sites of worship is another. The Souvenirs are another. And there's all sorts of other, all sorts of interesting pressures on the present in Russia at the moment. It's an unusual country that would completely reject the entire Soviet past, or its entire past up to, even if a revolution, or this wasn't technically a revolution, I guess, but even if there's a real clear end of that regime. For obvious reasons of identity, you have generations of people who grew up in the system. So to say, well, the whole system was illegitimate is not a good strategy for building a new system. And that's what Putin is actually struggling with, not struggling very well, in my opinion, but that's what he's struggling with, really. Sites which get at that relationship with the past and the present, I think, are very interesting sites. And the innovative students, the imaginative students, really get at those sites. And then good work is also done on various. For example, Gatchina is one of those. Would be a great site where you see the German imprint on Soviet Russia in Gatchina, in this fortress, because it only started to be renovated about a decade ago, as opposed to all the other palaces which are now in shiny Disney fashion pre-revolutionary palaces, with almost no sense of what happened to them during the revolution. Gatchina still has the marks of both the revolution and the World War II, Great Patriotic War. Unfortunately, as we realized when we were going around with our guide, and we had a conversation about this with the students, it's been renovated. And one of the most impressive parts of Gatchina was one long archway with, at the end of the archway is all stripped down, all the plaster had been stripped down. And it was as it had been at the end of the war, when the Germans had tried to blow it up. So everything was destroyed in it, and then had a picture of what it looked like in 1937-38. So it was very palatial, very expensive paintings on there, and every now and then they'd have these projectors which would project the original paintings on the side of this destroyed wall, which is extraordinarily impressive because you had the present concerns, old Gatchina, plus what the Germans had done to it. And you have a really good, interesting encounter with the past in that. The guides told us that would all be gone. It's all going to be renovated. It's going to be as good as Peterhof, as one of the guides said. Now that's an interesting encounter with the past, which can foster a really good conversation with students about the past and the present needs of the past,
Right.
And the past is always defined by present needs.
Right. And so many of the palaces and other places of memory in Petersburg are becoming these palimpsests.
They're cookie cutters. I mean, there are times I'll be going around Peterhof and I can forget that I'm in Peterhof and I may well be in Pavlovsk or somewhere else, you know.
Right.
There are different styles of palaces, I know that, but there's only so many gold-plated rooms, gold-plastered rooms that you can go through. And now, having said that, there were some students who were really impressed by these palaces. They were jaw-dropping for these students in terms of just their sumptuousness and their. But even those students who were really impressed with the sheer affect of this, or the sheer effect, I should say, of these palaces, which are so sumptuous, would inevitably in our conversations come back to, well, you know, what did this have to do with everyday life in Russia, both under the Tsars and in the post-Soviet period? You know, were these parts of our people's lives in Russia? So you can have interesting conversations like that as well. But there is a sense especially in a city like Petersburg, that the state is involved in the renovation to the point of obscuring the past, and that I think is a loss. You could do so many of these palaces were dynamited by the Germans when they left in 1945 or before 1945, and destroyed virtually. So they've been rebuilt. Now that's fine if that's what you want to do and that's part of your exhibition, but it's a different encounter with the past. It's not a particularly wrong one. It's just it is what it is.
Right.
But
For me, the Summer Garden was actually one of the interesting new places that would sort of reflect that difference.
yeah, we had a student who was going to work on the Summer Garden and the Alexandrov Garden, and I'm not sure exactly what she decided to do, whether she was going to compare the two. But that is one of those areas that has been renovated. It's a nice space, but it's a sort of an odd space because all of the statues have been reconstructed, and the extraordinary thing about the Summer Garden, I think, is that it's an oasis in the middle of what is a very busy part of Petersburg, and kudos to the government city government for trying to do that, to get spaces where Petersburgers can actually go and relax, because Mars Field is a bit of a wasteland still, you know, and one of the interesting things about the gardens especially was we often came across plinths where the statues had been taken down, with no record of which statue had been there. So I've gone back in some of my early photographs 3 years ago and 6 years ago when I did the program to see what the statues were, because I tend to photograph the same places each time. Not by design, but just because I forget what I photographed before. So there are certain statues that are disappearing, and it would be an interesting exercise to find out which statues have gone and why, if you could find that out. We may be reading too much intent into this. It may just be that the statue's been taken away for renovation and they decided to put a different one up there.
So what's your favorite part about doing this summer program?
It gets me back to Russia. It gets me back to speaking Russian. And one of the drawbacks of being a Russian historian in America is that it's actually tough to get all the way across there and spend significant time in Russia. And it's also a predominantly English language culture, so where if you're in Europe you're exposed to different foreign languages all the time. It gets me back to Russia. It gets me back to I have to speak Russian, which is good, because I have to do all the administration for this, I have to deal with the Petersburg state people, setting up things. That's one of the main things. But the other thing is, and I've done a lot of these programs now, I've done Cambridge program, Prague program, Petersburg program, I've been to Leiden a couple of times. What I like is seeing the groups of students and getting to know them a little bit better than I do here. In class of 35 I get to know the students, but not like a class of 14 where you're with them 6 weeks, you're worried about them, so you're looking after them as much as you possibly can. But you want them to go out and have a good time, and you see them as young adults outside of the classroom, which is a very different experience. You see how they're... I think the thing that I like most about it is seeing students who I think might have difficulty adapting to Russia, adapting beautifully. It just amazes me. There are some students who put into this very foreign situation, and it is still an exotic culture, put into a situation where we look after them as much as we can, but they are out on their own, in this group of students as well, but often on their own, that they actually grow into the experience. And so I tend to know these groups of students better than I know probably many other groups of students, apart from, say, the senior seminar, capstone seminar courses we teach, where we have 15 students for a semester. So I'm with them in class, I'm with them on excursions. I'm with them sometimes on the night train to Petersburg, where you get to know them better. In Moscow State University, I stayed in the dorms with the students.
So you've been doing this research trip abroad for a few years now. It's a lot of work. What is the benefit for you? What's the benefit for the students?
By setting them up with a subject, you can actually do some... This isn't research where it's going to be publishable, but it is research which is more than a quick term paper. So it's something where thought has gone into it. That one credit course in the spring prepares them in terms of doing some background research. When they get there, they then see this site, and that's why it's important to have this kind of site of memory, something that's sort of a physical or site or some kind of clear concept that they're studying. Because that gives them something where they can actually, on the ground in Russia, on the ground in Prague, on the ground in Cambridge, can actually go to this site, ask people about it, and see the site in its own context, in its own cultural context. And then we make them write it up because it just keeps them honest, right? So they have to write something up that is, and they know this stuff is going to be on the web if it reaches that level.
So do you find that by giving them a particular site, it gives them an anchor from which to understand other...
Yeah. I don't give them the sites. I kind of nudge them towards certain sites. And one thing I'm very adamant of, sometimes you'll get, out of every group, one or two students at the end of the one credit semester will say, one credit course will say, I think I might change my site. I say, no, you've done the background work here. The next stage is now that you build on this when you're in Russia, or when you're in Prague, or when you're in Potsdam, or wherever you are. So they go there with a core of sort of an understanding of what they're studying. And the next thing is then to bring the cultural context in, so they see this object that they've been studying through books in a much more living form. And that's I think what we have in the Russian program is pretty much, I think, the best you can do for research abroad if you have so many other demands on students' times. You know, you do want them to be out and about in these areas. You do want them to be, if possible, mixing with the locals. That's part of it. The Russian students are in homestays, so they're with Russians for much of the day. They're with me at various times, but they're really with, you know, the opportunities here. And this is probably the part about the research is, if you're trying to get the students immersed in the local culture, homestays is part of it. They will be with Russians all the time. They need to have something to say to the Russians. They need to have some knowledge, basically. And they're not going to get that knowledge really when they're there in terms of a sort of an understanding of, say, if you're doing something on, one student worked on the Second World War, Great Patriotic War. So he'd done some background work already on that before he got there. And he said he had some interesting conversations with his homestay family, and they were kind of impressed that he knew something about it. So without that sort of preparation, you could get into these conversations where you're speaking Russian but don't have a lot to say.
So you're saying one of the benefits is that they actually go being, perhaps, at least in this one small topic, more expert than the people that they're actually going to be speaking to, and it gives them some sort of authority.
Right, it gives them authority, and it gets them out of what is... They come out usually speaking very well colloquial Russian, everyday Russian. But we also want them to be able to have an intelligent conversation on slightly deeper subjects as well. And you need preparation for that in any foreign culture. I think the most disquieting thing is when you hear somebody offering a disquisition on a local culture that they've only just visited, which you hear all the time with foreigners, right? And we want to avoid that with our students if possible. You know, we don't want them offending anybody when they're there, offending through ignorance. So I think the research project really helps in that sense to prepare it.
Well, that's all for today. Thank you for listening, and a big thanks to Fred Corney for participating. This is Mike Bloom at the College of William & Mary. Until next time.